Today we have Rama Rao with us. She's the head of payments, compliance, and strategic financial products APAC at Uber. She's also an advisory board member, and she's lived in a lot of worked in a lot of places from Malaysia, Singapore, Chile, and now the Netherlands. Those are all very different and have different communication cultures as well, which we're going to get into today. She's also a public speaker on embedded finance, payments, but also women's empowerment, something that she's really passionate about. And we'll get into that a little bit today. So welcome, Rima.
Thank you for having me today. Very excited to be here.
We have some very interesting topics that we're going to discuss, given your background. It's not that common, someone to have all those experiences that you've had in different locations and cultures as a woman. So why don't we start with a time that you unapologetically spoke up to delineate an important boundary for yourself? Because that's something that is very hard for us sometimes, is to share our boundaries with other people and talk about them, because it's often very uncomfortable. So I'd love to know from you, has that happened and how it went?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's happened multiple times, but I think the jarring one that comes up is actually an example I had in a previous job role. I was actually seconded to a client to get a particular project done. And on the first day that I arrived, the client mentioned that he preferred a Caucasian man, preferably European, to do the job. I obviously did not see the reason why this should be the case, given I can understand cultures well. I know exactly what the client's brief was and I could deliver. And I think that was one of the things that really made me feel uncomfortable, as you put it. But even more so, in my belly, you have this really uncomfortable feeling, like your heart throbs and those types of things. It got even more uncomfortable in my head that I told myself, if I don't speak up, I'm going to be way more uncomfortable, despite how uncomfortable it would be speaking up. So I told myself I'm going to go back to the partner of the firm and just let him know this has happened, which I did. And he just told me to suck it up. It's a new client. And I think that's not something that hit me right away when he said it. It's only when the train home, got back to my apartment, sat down, undid for the evening, when I realized that that was not okay. I think I was trying to normalize it in my head, that entire conversation I had with partner. Then he told me it was a new client, suck it up. And then it just got to a point where I told myself, no, this is not what I stand for. My parents did not raise me this way. And I need to establish some really strong boundaries here as to what I'm okay with and what I'm not. So thought it through, decided regardless of how uncomfortable it was going to be and how I was just going to be left with no job right away, I quit next day. But it's all about enforcing those boundaries. That made me happier than having to stick around and deal with that kind of client. Yeah.
So do you regret speaking up at all?
No, definitely not. It was one of the best decisions I made. It definitely taught me a lot about what I'm okay with and what I'm not in the corporate workspace. And it also made me question a lot of other examples in the past that I may have said I'm okay with when really I'm not. And then I started asking myself, why would I say I'm okay with those things? It took a very jarring hit on the head as an example to really make me deep dive into myself and ask myself, I should have said no all those times as well. So I've learned my lesson, and very happy that I made that decision and no regrets whatsoever.
And what's interesting about your example is that you spoke up in a situation because you realized that you were going to feel more uncomfortable by not speaking up, but you didn't get the support that you're expecting to get at all. Quite to the opposite, right? You got a really harsh response.
Yeah.
Often when people speak up and they get a very negative response that was not at all what they were expecting, sometimes they shut down and decide not to speak up anymore because, hey, it's not worth it. People are not responding well to it. But for you, it was quite the opposite. You said, you know what, this was totally worth it, because it showed you, right? Not only that you had these boundaries that you weren't really protecting, but it made you reflect about your boundaries, but it also helped you understand where you were and what the limits were and what the culture was where you were, and if it was a good fit or not for you. If you hadn't had that response, you would have probably continued to try to stick to that a company or role for longer when it wasn't serving you and it wasn't going to serve you. So you're able to unlock information that otherwise you wouldn't have by speaking your mind.
That's spot on, Ina. And also, I think if I had stuck around, I would have been molded into something I wasn't. I would have spoken with my hit voice, convinced myself that this is okay. Can you imagine what I would have turned out as a person? So I'm very glad that decision was made. And today, here I am. I'm happy and very excited about all the work that I'm doing. So it was a good decision.
Yeah, you found a place that actually does suit you and your qualities and what you have to offer. And you've been doing all these other amazing things at the same time. So it's clearly worked out for you. Maybe you didn't know that at the time, but now you do.
Yes, I do. Yes.
And have you ever tried to be someone that you are not? Speaking of fit and authenticity, have you ever tried to be someone that you didn't feel like you really were, that was you in the workplace?
I think everyone has. I am no different. When I started off in the corporate world, I joined really big organizations and I used to get really good managers. But at the same time, whenever I was given the opportunity to be a little more visible or take on more tasks that would give me more visibility, I was always molded to think like a man, approach that particular work or task like a man. When you present, you need to spread yourself out a little more, lower your voice, that type of thing. I used to think that was how it was going to work in order for me to move up the ladder and for me to gain more understanding, knowledge, experience to get the career I wanted. And then when I moved to Uber, that was when things changed. So first day at Uber, and I've been molded to walk into a room and walk cry and be strong and get what I need and tell them I know what I want and this is the output I need. Walked into Uber, my first meeting, my first day, and was just extremely shocked by how kind everyone was. Welcome was extremely warm, and everyone just wanted to talk about me first as opposed to the work. And they wanted to know what kind of animals I liked or pets that I liked and those types of things. And we were in an actual meeting with an external client, actually, and they were joining in the fun, trying to get to know me. It was a really strange meeting. But that was when I realized that something's not right. Something's not right with this molding. This doesn't feel like how it should be or what I was taught it would be. And then a couple of weeks later, while I was dealing with business and also the people that I have made and built relationships with across the business, I happened to speak to the chair of Women at Uber at that time. Women at Uber is an employee resource group at Uber. And she was the chair of Women at Uber EMEA. She also happens to be a good friend till date. And I was talking to her and I was like, what is this employee resource group? What do you do? Surely as a company, you just preach diversity, equity, and inclusion, but don't really walk the talk. It's just for show. And she was like, Rema, the best way you can find out is to just join and see. So I did. I joined because I wanted to know, and I was also at that point trying to understand how this molding went wrong. And I thought in my head, maybe if I spoke to more women or spoke to more people or networked, I would figure the answer out. And that's what I did. I joined Women at Uber. And sure enough, it made me question a lot of things about the molding. Whether I was authentically why was I appeasing people a little bit whenever I was on calls, trying to make them understand my point as someone in compliance, and especially a woman in compliance. And secondly, why did I feel like I had to go to war at every meeting? What was this molding? And a lot of times when I was speaking to a lot of women in the network, it felt like they went through the same experience or something similar. And it just got to a point where I started unconsciously unmolding or unlearning the mold that I was in. And then I decided, let me go and get a career coach because I feel this is a lot deeper than I think it is. And I'm not sure a network of women can help me figure the answer out. So I got a career coach. And lo and behold, I actually figured out what got to me and why it was so easy for me to be molded, for me to be able to appease people or just be able to do what people say. It turns out that when I was 5 years old, I was actually signed up for ballet lessons by my mom. It was one of her dreams to be a ballerina. Indian ballerinas is not common in Malaysia. Generally, we have three main races in Malaysia. We have the Malays, the Chinese, and Indians. And so I'm Malaysian Indian. And whenever you go to a ballet class or a ballet school, you never do see Indians. It's always Chinese ladies or girls. So my first ever ballet lesson at 5, I was the only Indian in the class, and you had a lot of Chinese girls around. They refused to associate themselves with me because of my skin color. And I did everything I could to try and make them talk to me, because as a 5-year-old, you know nothing about racism. You just think it's, oh, it's me. There's something wrong with me. I need to say something nicer. I need to do this and do that. It doesn't hit you in the head that it's racism. And that's when it started. That's why I was so easily molded. That's why I thought, oh, this was the way to go, and this is how I need to do things. So appeasing people was one of them. And it got to a point where I started to think, the more I keep doing this, the more it's going to hinder me from moving up the ladder, because it's not productive trying to make everyone happy, as opposed to fully doing your job and saying no when you need to say no. And during the time that I was having the coaching sessions with my coach, he came up with a couple of solutions. So in order for me to wind down this personality, which we named the clown, that was easily molded, that would appease people, or that would try to make people laugh when they were not feeling okay on a call, when they were execs on it, he decided to do the unthinkable. So I love music, I love to sing. And he asked me what musician or singer do I like least. And I apologize for all the Justin Bieber fans out there. What's coming? So I said Justin Bieber. And bless this man, he basically told me every single time I feel the personality come up, or when it does come up, I'm going to need to sing a Justin Bieber song. Now, I cannot tell you how much I loathe this man, but man being Justin Bieber. So that really did stop me in my tracks and stop the personality from coming up. It came up once, but I was aware of it. So that was already a win. And then the second time it almost came up, I pushed it aside. And I was like, I'm not going to sing a Justin Bieber song. No, not today. And happy to confirm that personality has never come up since. And ever since then, I have felt almost, I don't know myself fully yet. I'm still learning about myself, right? And I will until the day I die. So I can say maybe 99.9% authentically myself now.
Wow. That's a great story. And I love Justin Bieber singing. It's impressive that you only had to do it once after that.
Oh, but that involved a lot of saging around the house. And it was, yeah, I couldn't sleep because I was like, oh my God, what have I done? I've just sung a song from a musician that I absolutely loathe.
Oh my gosh. And I'm sure a lot of people do like Justin Bieber. So
yeah, I
that is
apologize for those that do, but I will say despite how much I hate the man, he has definitely contributed to making myself a better person. So
he doesn't even know about that, but he's
does not.
helping out. And you're right. It's if we have to spend these 40, 50, 60 hours a week that we spend at work being who we aren't. And you said something very interesting. You said going into meetings felt like a war every single time. And when you said that, I recalled back the days in which going to meetings felt like a war. And it's not because it's a war, it's because we're trying to fit in a way that is not natural to us. So I thought that was a very well put. And going back into our lives, there's always those moments that define a little bit of that need, that desire to want to be liked and fit in and not be rejected. And your story is one of them. And I'm sure that you've probably encountered other situations like that that reinforce that desire to be liked as a woman and as a woman of color. And since you have changed and you have been more of yourself, first of all, what does that look like? What does being yourself look like in a meeting, in a conversation at work with senior leaders on a call? And what kind of response did you get from people, especially people that don't look like you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it was an overnight change, to be honest. That's what my former manager would always say, because he went through that journey with me. And he also had a career coach himself at some point. But when I did tell him that was what happened weeks later, after he noticed the change, he was like, oh, that explains it. Justin Bieber. It was definitely an overnight change, and people did notice because I was a lot more assertive, but assertive in my own way. Not that I wanted to go to war, but in a way where I felt was right, respectful, and at the same time adaptable to different personalities in the call. I wasn't appeasing people, but rather I was reading the room better, and I was reading personalities better and trying to tailor my language, my tone to who it was, but never changing the point I was trying to put across and never changing my stance. So that was a different me immediately. And I think the reactions from people who definitely didn't look like me also did come across similarly. My former manager was a white cisgender male. For him to have noticed, and then for the other people that I work with that generally don't look like me, who have also noticed, and also the women network that I was part of at that point, that I wasn't leading at that point, but I was part of, they also noticed. They started to take me a lot more seriously. I felt that was what happened. They started to realize that, okay, she's making good points, she's getting it across. Whereas previously in my head, I would think, let me just stop and make this person happy before I get my point across. So it changed. The tone changed. There was a shift. People noticed. And that's what started getting me to a point where people not just took me seriously, they started to see me in a different light. She's a leader in her own right. It was one of those things. So it was definitely a monumental change for me. And yeah, it was a ripple effect across the stakeholders and the people that I was working with.
Wow, a monumental change. And I love the way you defined being assertive in your own way. I thought that was a great definition. Now, you said people start to take you more seriously and see you as more as a leader. What made you feel that way? What were you observing in people in the way, because that was a sudden change, right? And so, sometimes there's resistance. I'm glad you didn't get any resistance. Instead, you noticed something positive in the way people were responding to you. How did you actually notice? What were they doing? What were they saying that made you feel like they were taking you more seriously?
I had stakeholders that would pretend that I didn't exist in the room, suddenly moved to listening to me attentively. And as a woman, that usually happens. You either get shut down, you got talked over. It goes, the list goes on. As a woman of color, yeah, times 10. So that shift started happening. And I started to notice, because these are the kinds of things that go through my head when I do speak to people. Are they going to look at me for my skin color? Are they going to take me seriously as a person first? And as a person that's performing in my role? I started to feel it was the latter after I went through that coaching period, and I made sure the clown didn't come up. So that was definitely something that I noticed. I think one meeting specifically, I actually had a slightly difficult stakeholder that used to push back and say that compliance is disruptive to business and things like that, which every single stakeholder that deals with compliance would say. And generally, after saying that, they would just rant and you just have to listen. And this time around, when I did not want to deal with the rant and I would just say, this is what you need to do, this is why you need to do, this is how it's going to make your business better, they kept quiet and nodded and then agreed along with it. That's when I felt, okay, it's getting true. But why is it getting true now and not before? I'm saying the exact same thing. So that's when I started to realize that it's also the way I was speaking was very different. And at the same time, they were responding to me because they believed what I was saying. In the past, when I was trying to convey things, I knew what I was saying. But because I was trying to be someone I was not, I was molded to be, or go to war. You're not yourself, really. No one's going to buy that. No one's going to believe that. So I felt when I was a little more authentic and this is me, people were like, oh, I can relate to that.
I love that, Rema, especially the overnight transformation and the amazing results that you got by just finding your own style of voice. Not finding, you found it, just using it and letting it be, and getting in that way people to believe in you because it was effortless for you. It was just speaking about the things that you believed in and not going into war.
And not caring about what other people thought about what I was saying, because I knew I was doing my job and I knew that I was right. And if they had a different perspective, I wanted to hear it. I would love to have explored it with them, but I did not care about the negativity that was coming in. I just wanted to focus on what I was doing and tried to be as collaborative as possible in that environment at the same time. So I think that was very important to note.
Yeah, that's very important because sometimes as women, we're bombarded with this message that we always have to care. We have to care deeply, care about people, care about them, care about the reaction, care about everything and everybody except ourselves.
Yes. That's what my coach said. He was like, Rema, why do you care about how that person feels on the call? Why do you care about that person? It's sucking the energy out of you. Do you not realize? Do you not want to care about yourself? what am I going to have for dinner in 2 hours? When am I going to have my tea break? And I was like, it's a very interesting perspective. That's also when it, just like how you put it, that's also what hit me. Like, why do I need to take care of everyone? I am just my own self and my own person, and I have my own life and me to take care of. So let's focus on that first.
Yeah. And one of the assertive rights in the Assertive Bill of Rights is the right to not care. We have the right to not care about things and people and everyone on all the time. And so it's great to be able to hear it from you. Just say it without the guilt. I don't care.
Yeah.
It's liberating.
Yes, it is.
So, Rima, what strategies and conversations have you used in your career to be able to advance and move ahead and move towards what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think I've never always known what I've wanted. Growing up, when I first started off my career, I always knew what I wanted. And then at some point, when this molding happened and I got a bit lost and I was like, why am I like this? I was like, do I really know what I want? So I was at some point not someone that knew what they wanted. I was a little lost. I was swimming and I was like, how am I going to navigate this? How do I figure out what I want? And I think there are a couple of ways that I thought about while I was swimming as to how I could get out of it and also swim in different directions to see what I like. And I think I had that privilege to do it. Not everyone has that privilege to test and try and see if this is what they like to do. So I'm a compliance professional, but it was the first ever profession I joined, and it fortunately or fortunately, I'm still in it. I tried to leave it, but I was brought back into it by the leaders at Uber. So one of the first strategies I thought about was I need to firstly build a huge network, and not just a network of professionals, network of women. One of the ways I thought I would do that is by being immersed in women at Uber. I was doing work with women at Uber. I was launching initiatives, campaigns, events, and things like that across Uber and EMEA. And that actually helped me build relationships with other women across the business, including leaders. And I was working alongside GMs, your general managers that were also volunteering to be part of Women at Uber and running initiatives. And I started to learn from them that the one thing that came up, which I always thought was the case, was not self-advocacy. I am very much Asian. So as an Asian brought up in an Asian environment, you have that stereotypical mindset that you just put your head down, do the work, and people will recognize you. And I've realized it's even more so in women. You don't have to be Asian for it. Women also go through this in their head. I always thought that was the case until I got to Uber, spoke to women, and they were like, "What are you waiting for? If you don't speak up and say you want that, no one's gonna wait for you. You got to speak up. You got to be bold, and you got to say what you want to who you want and get what you want." So I started to apply that strategy. So networking and then self-advocacy. I started to self-advocate for myself. And I started to go around asking people, hey, I really like to do that. Can I try that? I like that task. Can I take that on? Even in my team at that point, there were some new little things that were coming in. And I was like, I'd like to do that. I think I'm going to be good at that. I'm really good with stakeholder management. I'll take that on. So volunteering for those kinds of things, because I knew I would be good at it, but also to discover if it was going to be something I liked. And that was also what led me to pivot from compliance to strategy, because I knew I'm good at people management, and at Uber is a people company. If you don't build relationships with people at Uber, you don't get anywhere. So I already had that locked in. Now I just needed to learn how to make strategy work. And that being said, I also went through like the third strategy, or maybe lesson, I would say, for myself. When you do strategy in any company, you don't just need to have a vast network. You don't just liaise with leaders. You also start to realize that leaders have to take you seriously. They don't have all the time in the world. They maybe have 20 minutes for you, 25 max. And in that 25 minutes, you're going to need to sell something. You're going to need to speak about something, give them updates on something. And I realized that in order for them to potentially take me seriously and want to give me more work or tell me to help them on something different or give me more visibility, I had to build up my personal brand. That is the next lesson, the next strategy. How do I build up my personal brand, and what do I do to do it? Now, it just so happened when I pivoted to this new role, I was in the running to be the chair of Women at Uber in EMEA. It was not a role that I wanted or I even thought of I would even get, because somehow deep down my confidence, I don't know where it went. It was up in the sky somewhere. But my predecessors, they told me, hey, just get an application in. And I was like, okay, it's because I'm doing a lot of work. Maybe that's why they just want me to put it in. So I put it in. I didn't expect anything out of it. I went into the interview for that role and I screwed it up so badly because I was just a robot talking about what I'm going to do and focused on how I'm going to make women at Uber email like the next thing, that I forgot to tell them the story about me and why I won the role. And that was one of the feedback points that was given by one of the leaders that was on the call. And she was like, Rema, you're great. The moment you started talking about all the impact that you want to do, your eyes lit up. But we need to hear the story. It wasn't connecting the story. And I was so gutted when I was like hearing that and the debrief, which happened 5 minutes after the interview, which I thought was also random because I was like, why are you suddenly calling me to say, do you have time to talk? And that was when I learned as well that this is how leaders look at you. They have 25 minutes or 20 minutes to dedicate to you. If you don't tell a story, it's not going to fly. You need to sell them something, but you need to tell that story. So personal branding was super important. Who you are, what are you fighting for, and why you want that. Yeah. So needless to say, I got the role, which I was extremely shocked by, given that I screwed it up so badly. And that has stuck with me ever since. And ever since then, I started to build my personal brand. I started to put myself out there a lot more. I started to get into panels internally, speaking externally. And everywhere I go, I try to tell a story. That is the most important piece for me. As much whatever the output is going to be, what matters is I get the story across so you can relate to it and you understand it in a layperson's language that this is what happened and this is how it's going to get better.
Wow. And first of all, I just want to say, Rema, thank you for sharing your stories with us. That's what this podcast is all about, exactly because of that. Because stories are relatable. We can learn a lot from stories. And nobody wants a list of things that they know that they need to do when they already know they need to do it, but they don't have the connection. They don't see the passion. They don't see your background. And so the storytelling in the business world also works. I'm with senior leadership. And it was interesting that you said, and it reminded me, venture capital funds, and when we're selecting, and early stage investors as well, venture capital investors, when they're interviewing these businesses and the founders of these new ideas and startups, the number one thing they're looking for is the story behind the founders. And that's the number one factor. They want to see the passion. They want to see the drive through that story of that founder. And if that's not there, they're not going to fund that startup. And it's interesting that you share this because that's your own experience as well with leaders in your organization. In the interviews that you go to, in the conversations that you have, people want a story and they want to see your passion reflected in that story. So wonderful that you share that. Plus the three factors that you share, the networking, the self-advocacy that is so key, and the building your personal brand. And for all three of those, we need to be able to speak our minds unapologetically.
Yep, you're so right. And plus one on what you mentioned on the venture capitalism and how they invest in founders, because it's true. Leaders, companies, they invest in people. It takes a while to realize that. It takes a while for everyone to really get that. I think the further you move up, the further you start speaking to more leaders, you start to realize like that they would be willing and happy to spend time with you only if they're invested in you. And the only way they're going to get invested in you is if you tell your story.
And it goes back to the authenticity and the not following a mold, because when you're filling a mold, it's very hard to show others and leaders who you really are and your passion and your drive for things and for your ideas.
Yes.
Very interesting. And another thing that we saw from your CV, your curriculum, is that you've worked in many places, right? You started off in Malaysia, then Singapore, Chile, Netherlands. And in those environments, you also worked with teams and clients in those countries, but also with clients in Japan and Taiwan. So you've had an international career. How have you been able to adapt, and have you needed to adapt at all your communication and how you approach speaking your mind in those situations while still being authentic?
Yeah, I had to adapt a lot, many times. I spent 7, 8 years of my career out of a suitcase, basically. and I had a base in Singapore and Malaysia and Chile, the Netherlands, right? Now I'm in the Netherlands and I'm based here, but I was traveling a lot for work as well in all my other roles, including my current one. And oftentimes in different places I had not really spent enough time at, or I was just there for holidays. Let's take Chile, for example, which I found to be extremely strange. There was always similarities with home, and we can get into a whole other discussion of where home is and what home is. But for me, I've always felt home is more Malaysia, is where I've grown up. Home now is Amsterdam, obviously. And when I went to Chile, obviously I didn't have a benchmark against Amsterdam at that point. I just had Malaysia and Singapore. I felt the family values, the Asian family values, you take care of your parents, you spend a lot of time with your family and things like that. That was very prevalent. So I definitely related to that. What I couldn't relate to was the tardiness. And I think it's just because Chile, South America generally, everyone's pretty laid back. And I was working at 100 miles an hour in Singapore and then having to move from Singapore to Chile for work. And having to go from 100 miles an hour to, and I was like, hold on. And when a Chilean says they're going to be there at 10 p.m., expect them to be there at 12. You're going to need to wait. And when you have business meetings with clients, you're advised to come at most 10 minutes earlier and expect to wait for 15 to 20 minutes later after the proposed time of the meeting for your client. And when you start the meeting, you're actually talking about yourself, your family, and things like that. And I think maybe last 10 minutes into the meeting, you actually talk about work. It's all about building relationships in the Chilean culture. And once you do, they start opening up, they let their guard down. So they're pretty guarded. In Taiwan, for example, that's also a different type of culture. So I took on a team in Taiwan last year and very happy to be still leading that team today. I would say the way they approach things is extremely respectful for a lot of other cultures. It's what we would consider that. For example, asking someone, may I clarify if this is actually how you would do it? May I? There's a lot of different nuances to how they speak, which is beyond extremely respectful compared to other cultures. Like for me, if I wanted clarity on something, I'll just be like, so sorry, don't really get this. Could you clarify this? Like direct, but at the same time respectful. But for them, it's beyond respectful, and it has to be structured in a way that is prim and proper. So I had to adapt to that because my approach may come across as slightly direct. So I made sure to immediately when I got there, I was like, what is the cultural sensitivity that I need to be aware of? And because I've worked in so many of these places, I always start with today, whenever I go into a new market or when I have to talk to teams in a new market and I'm not sure what the culture is, I start with, okay, what is the sensitivities I need to take into account? What works, what doesn't? Sometimes I don't have a choice and I do need to go into the market before I can ask myself that question. Maybe there's a fire that I need to put out and it is just what it is. And then I need to think of that later on. This happened with Japan recently, where I had stakeholders that may not necessarily have been more forthcoming. And I think they had their own way of doing things and were not very open with having people from other countries or other teams globally come in and tell them what to do. So I actually spoke to one of my colleagues who was in Japan and was also part of the business, one of the leaders in the business. And I think she advised me and she told me, here's the local nuances of how it works in Japan. Here's what you should do, what you can do, and how you can keep building that relationship. And I think her advice definitely helped. So I would definitely advise anyone if you are working in a multicultural company, at the same time, if you have a job that requires you to travel to so many different places, you should always ask yourself, what is the cultural nuance that you need to take into account? And how can you go about adapting to that and being immersed in that when you are trying to get the job done? Because you do learn a lot of things from different cultures. And it does teach you a lot about your own culture and at the same time, what works for you and what doesn't. Culture is something you get immersed in. It's something that society creates, and it also comes from religion. It comes from how you're brought up. And I think that's something I've always been very fascinated by. So I've always been very open to new cultures, except where food is concerned. I will say in that lens, Malaysian food is the best. I cannot vouch for food from everywhere else. Malaysian food is the best.
I'm sure it is. I don't I'm not sure if I know Malaysian food that, even though I did live in Singapore. I'm sure I had Malaysian food. I just can't remember
Yeah,
exactly
it's similar.
how to
It's similar.
differentiate. But yeah,
Yeah.
those like fried rice with all sorts of interesting sauces and veggies and meats, those were delicious. And the hot pots were really good. I don't know if those are in Malaysia.
Yeah, we have hot pots too. We have satay.
Oh,
We have,
satay. Oh my gosh, that's so good.
yes. See, I'm making you hungry. See, this is
Yes,
why food is amazing.
I'll try to make something Malaysian inspired for lunch today. So it's interesting you have that experience, and it seems like the way that you do find those cultural nuances, like you did in Japan, was to reach out to a colleague who's in that culture and ask questions and ask for advice because that person would know exactly how to deal with those people in the way they function and communicate. And I can relate to the Chilean example as well as a Brazilian myself from origin.
Yes,
The
I got used
lateness.
to it. I
Yeah.
started getting used to it. When I moved from Chile to the Netherlands, I was proper Chilean all the way because when I dropped down in Amsterdam, I was late for everything. And I had to get back to the rhythm of maybe 90 miles an hour at least, not 10.
I was worried because we had two links for our meeting today, and I wasn't sure which one you were at. The first one, I came in right on time. I waited 2 minutes. I said, let me try the other link. So I was late by 2 minutes, but now you know why.
Yes. I love how you had to justify that. It is not the South American in me. No.
It is not the South American. It was managing the links. But UAE also, UAE, I did a course around businesses in UAE right before moving to UAE. And one of the things about Arab culture is similar to Chilean culture, which is you need to talk about yourself, your family, your values a lot before you get to business.
Yeah, I plus one on that. I do deal with Mia as well till date because I'm still leading Women at Uber for Mia. We are rolling out an initiative called Geek Sister across EMEA, and we are focused our H2 efforts mostly on the Mia mega region. Because it just feels like the better thing to do and to make sure that women drivers get a community. Geek Sister is basically an initiative where we've carved out to create a self-sustainable community for women drivers. That being said, the way we do it is we have events, and in that event, we have multiple different tracks that we feature. We have the general managers that are present. We have the leadership that are present that talks to women drivers. They tell them, here's what your benefits are. Did you know about this? And education. And then we also advise them we encourage them to bring friends and family because driving with Uber is also a job. It's not something you need to look down on, but if you want to know more about this job, come around and get to know what exactly your mom, your sister, or your friend does. So that's why we called it Gig Sister, by the way. It's a friendly name. So when they do come in, we do educate them, and then at the same time, we do have multiple different tracks. Our most famous track is actually the one with L'Oreal, where we roll out the anti-harassment trainings live. And if you go into L'Oreal's website, stand up, you will see Eva Longoria showing you multiple different ways to stand up for yourself against street harassment. And we basically take that training that's online and translate it into an in-person training for women drivers. Because if they are driving at night or any time of the day for that matter, and you have a rider that's trying to be funny, whatever it is, we can teach them how to defend themselves in those situations in a car. So it's actually super fun, very interactive, and they absolutely love that. And then on top of that, we also have a networking session where they can talk and meet. And then we also create a city WhatsApp group for them to connect. And it's mended by them for them. So we create it, we get out of it. And then they have it to chat, talk about it. And we keep in touch with some of the ladies that are mending. We chat so they can tell us what kind of improvements can we make for women drivers at Uber. If they can give us suggestions, what can we incorporate in the product better? How can we make their lives so much more meaningful? So that is Gig Sister in a nutshell and what we do. And it's something that is very close to everyone's heart in Women at Uber, in EMEA especially. So we are definitely focusing our efforts in the UAE. So it's a long answer to what I was trying to get to. And in my dealings with general managers and also the team across the MENA region, there's definitely that element of, yeah, you're going to need to wait. You're going to be late. So be prepared to deal with a little tardiness. But at the same time, you also need to be prepared to deal with talking about yourself. They want to get to know more about you and your family and where you're from. oh, you look like you could be one of us. I'm like, no, from Malaysia. And then it just goes on and on talking about holidays. Oh, I've been there. I love this place, this city. So I definitely relate to your example. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people try to shut their personal side out because they think, you know what, people are not going to take me seriously if they see me as a wife, as a
Yeah.
mom, as someone who likes to cook and bake and music. None of this is professional, so I'm not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And then you don't talk about anything personal, and then you miss out on that aspect of building relationships at work because people support those that they know and trust.
You're so right. You're so right about that. A lot of people tend to hide their true selves. They put on a different persona. But let's be clear, everyone has different personas, and that's fine. But I think this applies to some of us that put on a very strong persona to hide or stay on guard to reveal anything personal about ourselves because we feel that could be perceived as a weakness of any sort. For example, if you're a caregiver, maybe that's a weakness. If I say that, if I speak too openly about that, oh, they'll take advantage of that piece. They'll think that I'm not a leader. I can't be promoted. So you still do have those types of sentiments across whenever I network with women, even internally in the company or externally.
Yeah, and it's true. There's some biases around that. And I think that the challenge is how do you bring those stories? Because clearly stories do support you in bonding with leaders. How do you bring those stories in a way that will actually connect rather than detract? And one other thing that I thought was super interesting about your work currently is your role in lobbying. And you have a team of lobbyists as well who are primarily female. And
I
I
don't
thought
really have a
this
team of
is so
lobbyists. I have a
fun.
team of fabulous compliance officers.
Oh my gosh, this is so exciting to hear because I just remember I was just telling you in business school, there was a professor who was all into lobbying, and I didn't even know this existed. So, what does it look like? What does lobbying look like? What kind of communication do you need to lobby? And why does it even exist? How does it work?
Yeah, I think those types of things are generally done by public policy. As you so rightly put it, it's usually a policy team or a legal team that runs the show. And I think for Taiwan, we definitely had a very different approach, given that we had different regulators, changes in who we were dealing with. So my team actually was pretty hands-on about making sure that we spoke our mind with enforcement agencies and the regulator as to what works for us and what doesn't. They're doing really good work, very important work for a market to begin with. It's something that you have to continuously remind the team. But all in all, that's just how it has turned out. And I'm actually very proud that these are the kinds of strategies we come up with ourselves. Today, we advise the policy team. It's the other way around. Here's some information. Tell us if we were on the right track and tell us if you think this is what we should do. So it's a very interesting take, I feel.
Yeah, that is fascinating that you have that influence in supporting being the voice of the customer, but being also the voice for your company. And what you said was, in effect, challenging these enforcement agencies and regulators around what they're doing because you have information and knowledge that they can't necessarily see. And so it's actually a win, and you're actually delivering so much value as long as you're able to influence and persuade and challenge them, which again can be an uncomfortable conversation. There could be pushback, yet it seems like you are, and you and your team are successful at it. So that's lovely. You guys are speaking and it's working, it's effective. This has been a real treat. I've really enjoyed chatting with you and learning a lot about your speaking up journey in different aspects of your career and work and life, and how you've discovered yourself overnight and transformed yourself from this molded person into this free person who speaks your mind unapologetically and tells your story and brands yourself and networks and pursues the career that you want and challenges the regulators. It's beautiful. That's the power of speaking our minds and being able to do that. And there's no limit to it. We can always decide to change, and your story proves that. So thank you for sharing, Rema.
Thank you for having me. I had a blast speaking about my experiences, but more so also listening to some of the things that you've shared today. So it's been a great honor to be here. So thank you for having me. And I hope whoever that's listening in would actually benefit from what I was saying and could learn a trick or two and maybe help themselves as well. That being said, I am still not a Justin Bieber fan. I apologize, but we can thank him indirectly.